The instant I watched my cabin door swing, open on the security feed, panic wasn't. What hit me, what I felt was relief, because that image confirmed something I'd been waiting to see. Someone had finally stepped over the line. And once that line is crossed, the situation stops being about pressure and threats and becomes about consequences. I'd been anticipating this moment for weeks, watching the tension build little by little, like a terrible reality show I never agreed to be part of. The notices, the polite-sounding reminders, the carefully worded passive-aggressive warning slid under my door one after another, every single one traced back to the same source, Eleanor Blackwell, the self-declared authority of what had once been a peaceful lakeside neighborhood known as Cedar Hollow. Eleanor didn't realize it yet, but the cabin she was walking into wasn't just an aging family retreat with squeaky floors and dated wiring. It was a reflection, and every tactic she'd used on others for years was about to be reflected straight back at her. The security camera caught her pause at the entrance just long enough for her to straighten her blazer and put on that practice smile to kind people wear when they believe they can't be touched. Her heels echoed sharply on the hardwood floors my grandfather had laid by hand decades ago. I remember thinking how strange it was that something built with time, care, and effort could be treated like a nuisance by someone who'd never done an honest day of physical work. She had no idea she was stepping into a situation I'd been quietly preparing for nearly 6 months. This entire ordeal began the same way many of these stories do: loss, inheritance, and memories tied to a place. 6 months earlier, my grandfather, Henry Lawson, died at 91, stubborn and proud, right to the end. He left me his cabin on the northern edge of Cedar Hollow Lake, a simple 2-bedroom home on several acres of shoreline that had belonged to our family since the late 1940s. He built it himself after returning from the war, hauling lumber, cutting stone for the fireplace, wiring, most of it by hand back when that wasn't unusual. Every summer of my childhood was spent there, fishing from the dock, swimming until my lips turned blue, and listening to his stories by the fire as the wind moved through the trees like it remembered us. It was never fancy. No granite counters or trendy open layouts. The cedar siding had faded into that weathered silver gray that only comes from decades of sun and rain. The house groaned and creaked like an old man, stretching his joints, but it was solid, honest, and full of craftsmanship you rarely see anymore. When I finally came back to settle things after the funeral, I noticed the lake itself had changed. What used to be scattered family cabins had transformed into a polished vacation community. Manicured hedges, identical mailboxes, homes that looked like they'd all come from the same catalog. And at the heart of that transformation stood Eleanor Blackwell. She was a former real estate consultant from out of state who moved in 5 years earlier and within months somehow became president of the Cedar Hollow Shores Homeowners Association. I later learned her rise had far less to do with being liked and far more to do with intimidation and an uncanny ability to bend procedural rules without technically breaking them. Our first encounter happened 3 days after I arrived. I was cutting back overgrown brush near the dock when a white luxury SUV rolled down my gravel driveway like it already belonged there. Eleanor stepped out wearing crisp slacks, oversized sunglasses, and jewelry heavy enough to drag her into the lake if she leaned too far forward. She didn't introduce herself immediately. She just stood there, surveying the property with open disapproval, before finally saying, "You must be Henry Lawson's grandson," as if she were verifying gossip. "I'm Eleanor Blackwell, HOA president," she said, already pulling a thick binder from under her arm. "And we need to address several compliance issues. I wiped my hands on my jeans, gave her my name, and politely said I wasn't aware. The property fell under any HOA. Her smile tightened just barely. All lakefront properties were incorporated last year through a town council resolution. Your grandfather was notified, though given his condition, we understood compliance might be delayed. She placed a binder in my hands like a teacher dropping a textbook onto a desk. Inside were pages filled with color, coded tabs, citing violations, doc. Violations, landscaping violations. Apparently, my trees were too natural for her preferences. As I flipped through it, my stomach dropped. The fines, the deadlines, the carefully crafted language designed to feel unavoidable. This would cost tens of thousands, I said. I wasn't sure my grandfather would have agreed to any of this. Rules are rules, Eleanor replied, her smile never reaching her eyes. Standards must be upheld. Property values depend on it. Then she added, almost casually, that attendance at the next HOA meeting was mandatory. That night, I called my cousin Alex, a property attorney, and explained the situation. He didn't hesitate for a second. That doesn't sound right, he said. Check the county records. If your grandfather never signed HOA consent documents, they can't just absorb his land. The next morning, I spent hours digging through public records, and what I found confirmed what my gut already knew. The cabin was explicitly excluded from the HOA due to a historical designation, and my grandfather had refused to join in writing years ago. But that wasn't the most interesting discovery. The original survey maps showed that part of the HOA's clubhouse and marina had been built partially on land that still legally belonged to my family. Eleanor wasn't just lying. She was projecting. I attended the HOA meeting that Friday. Eleanor presided over the room like a judge who'd already decided the outcome. When I presented my documents, her response wasn't denial. It was dismissal. She brushed it aside, promised a private review, and shut down questions from other homeowners. That's when it clicked. This was never about rules. It was about control. After the meeting, neighbors quietly approached me, longtime residents, people who'd lived there for decades, all sharing the same experiences: selective enforcement, crushing fines, pressure to sell, gardens torn out, docks condemned, and somehow Eleanor, or someone connected to her, always appeared to buy the property. Soon after, when she cornered me in the parking lot and warned that things sometimes happen to vacant properties, I understood exactly what she meant. And I also understood something else. She'd just made a serious mistake, because intimidation only works when the other person is afraid. And I realized I wasn't afraid anymore. What I felt instead was curiosity, patience, and a very focused sense of motivation. I began documenting everything. I installed cameras, logged every citation, every surprise visit, every veiled threat. Slowly and intentionally, I started preparing the cabin not as a weapon, but as an experiment, because eventually people who believe they're above the rules always reveal it themselves. Eleanor Blackwell was no different. This is the point where I need to pause the story for a moment, because if you've ever had to deal with an HOA, or honestly any small power structure run by the wrong person, what was happening probably feels painfully familiar. By standard procedure, a homeowners association only has authority over properties that have voluntarily agreed to be part of it. That agreement is written, signed, and legally attached to the property deed. Without that paper trail, an HOA has exactly zero authority. No fines, no inspections, no mandatory meetings, nothing at all. So when Eleanor showed up with that binder full of violations, From a legal standpoint, she wasn't enforcing anything. She was bluffing, relying on fear, confusion, and the fact that most people never bother to check public records. And this is where the psychology matters. What she was doing was setting a trap, not the one I was building, but the one she believed in. It's called authority laundering. You wrap personal ambition in the language of community standards. You repeat phrases like property values and compliance until people stop asking who actually benefits. Once fear takes hold, most people give in because constant conflict is exhausting. But escalation always tells the truth. Someone who genuinely believes they're right doesn't hint at vandalism. They don't show up unannounced, and they certainly don't suggest that bad things happen when owners aren't around. That isn't governance. That's coercion. And coercion always creates blind spots because the person using it starts to believe their own story. They convince themselves they're protecting something, that they're necessary, that rules don't apply to them because they are the rules. The moment Eleanor crossed from paperwork into intimidation, she wasn't just risking a civil dispute anymore. She was drifting into criminal territory. That's the lesson before we return to the story. Power hates resistance, but it collapses under documentation, patience, and time. Once I understood that, I stopped reacting and started setting the stage. I didn't rush anything after that meeting. That's where people usually get it wrong. They think revenge is about speed, about acting while emotions are hot. But anger makes you careless. Patience gives other people space to expose themselves. Over the next few weeks, Eleanor's behavior followed a pattern so predictable it felt rehearsed. Citations appeared on my door every couple of days. Excessive vegetation, unapproved exterior color, non-compliant dock hardware. All nonsense, all carefully documented. When I removed one notice, another appeared. The very next morning, the cameras caught her more than once. Broad daylight, sunglasses on, moving like she was doing routine maintenance instead of trespassing. Then came the less subtle escalations. My truck was reported as abandoned, even though it was legally parked on my own land. My boat came loose during a storm in a way that didn't feel accidental. And one morning, the water to the cabin was shut off for emergency maintenance that somehow affected only my property. I logged everything, dates, times, screenshots, video, because in legal terms, patterns matter more than isolated events. One complaint is noise. 10 identical complaints are evidence. While all of that was happening, I was doing something else too. I was preparing the cabin my grandfather used to joke that the place had a personality. Floors that creaked if you didn't step just right, plumbing that groaned like it was clearing its throat before speaking. An old electrical panel labeled in a way that only made sense if you lived there long enough to learn its moods. Most people would call those flaws. I saw them as leverage. I installed a complete security system, cameras inside and out, everything feeding directly to cloud storage, audio included. Then I went over the plan with Alex one more time just to be certain. As long as you're not creating dangerous conditions meant to cause harm, he told me, you're fine. It's your property and you have no obligation to make it comfortable for trespassers. That was all the assurance I needed. I set what I thought of as inconvenience traps. Nothing illegal, nothing that could hurt anyone, just a series of deeply aggravating problems that would only affect someone unfamiliar with the house. The hot water heater looked fully functional, breaker on, indicator light glowing, but delivered only cold water. The motion activated. Lights shut off after 47 seconds of stillness, just long enough to make someone think they were faulty. The thermostat drifted too warm, then too cold, always just enough to be annoying. The toilet ran nonstop unless the handle was jiggled in a very precise way. The kitchen sink developed a drip that seemed to defy logic. Everything was monitored remotely. Everything could be reversed instantly. Then I moved on to the social side of the plan. I began attending town council meetings, joined the local historical society, donated some of my grandfather's photos and journals, and introduced myself as someone interested in preserving the lake, not fighting it. Neighbors began to open up quietly at first, then with growing confidence. They shared documents, old letters, finds that mysteriously increased right after they questioned Eleanor's decisions, and maps showing original property lines that didn't match the current narrative. Piece by piece, the picture sharpened, and then when the timing felt right, I did the single most important thing of all. I disappeared. I packed my truck in full view of several neighbors. I made sure to loudly mention I'd be gone for at least 2 weeks. I asked someone to grab my mail. I left lights on timers. I made it convincing. In reality, I was staying 2 miles away. Laptop open, security feeds, running nonstop. Based on Eleanor's past behavior, I suspected it would only take a few days before curiosity turned into entitlement. It took 2. On Wednesday evening, my phone vibrated. Motion detected at the front door. There she was, Eleanor, dressed like she was headed to a board meeting, not committing a crime. Right behind her stood Martin Cole, the HOA treasurer, holding a clipboard and wearing the unmistakable expression of a man already regretting every decision that brought him there. She tried to handle, then calmly pulled out a key. That part still amazes me. They let themselves in. Are you sure about this? Martin asked, his voice clearly picked up by the microphones. Relax, Eleanor replied as she flipped on the lights. We're conducting an official inspection after receiving complaints. It's in the bylaws. Then she added, almost casually, he's gone? No, one will know. They walked through my home like it belonged to them, commenting on my grandfather's furniture, calling it outdated, unsanitary, a fire hazard. They took notes, opened cabinets. Then the house started pushing back. The lights went out. Martin yelped. Eleanor swore she found the breaker and reset it. The shower blasted ice-cold water straight onto her blouse. The thermostat went haywire. The toilet refused to stop running. Each small inconvenience chipped away at her composure. After nearly an hour, they moved into the kitchen, and when Eleanor opened the refrigerator, the final system triggered. Click. Every exterior door locked with an audible thud. What was that? Martin asked. Oh, houses make noises, Eleanor snapped, still pretending she was in control. It wasn't until they tried to leave 15 minutes later that reality set in. The doors wouldn't open. Their phone showed no signal. The windows resisted just enough to make escape awkward and deeply humiliating. Panic crept in slowly. First, irritation, then frustration, then real fear, and just before it crossed into something dangerous, I released the locks. Eleanor yanked the door. It flew open, and she stumbled backward into Martin. Both of them tumbled onto the porch. At that exact moment, a neighbor happened to drive by. Coincidences are funny like that. Evening, he called out, slowing his truck. Didn't know anyone was staying at the Lawson place. Eleanor's face flushed red. Official business, she snapped. Funny, he replied. Don't recall any notices being posted. By the next morning, the story was already spreading when Eleanor told people at the coffee shop that my cabin was unsafe, uninhabitable, dangerous. I just smiled, because now she had a problem. She knew things she shouldn't. No, that night at the town council meeting, she tried to get ahead of it. She raised concerns, listed violations, spoke with confidence, and then I stood up. From a legal standpoint, what she'd done was indefensible. I played the footage. The room went silent, breaking and entering, unauthorized inspections, conflicts of interest, encroached land. One by one, the pillars of her authority collapsed. She argued, deflected, accused me of manipulation, but evidence doesn't care about tone. The police escorted her out. The council ordered audits. Surveys followed, and once the truth was exposed, it moved quickly. Eleanor wasn't removed because of one mistake. She was removed because she'd built an entire system that only worked in the dark, and I had turned on the lights. After everything settled, after the audits, the surveys, the meetings, that suddenly had standing room only attendance, people kept asking me the same question, usually in a lowered voice like it was a secret. Did you plan all of that? And the honest answer is no, not the way it unfolded. I didn't know when Eleanor would break in, who she'd bring, or how completely she'd unravel once control slipped through her fingers. What I planned for was simpler and more important. I planned for her to be herself, because the truth is people who abuse power don't need traps to fall into. They just need time, documentation, and the opportunity to keep behaving the way they always have. Psychologically speaking, Eleanor wasn't a cartoon villain. She was something far more common, someone who tied her identity to authority, someone who confused control with competence, someone who genuinely believed the community would collapse without her. That's why she couldn't walk away. That's why she escalated. And that's why she crossed lines she'd spent years telling everyone else never to touch. HOAs, in theory, exist to maintain shared spaces and protect residents. But when oversight disappears and leadership goes unchecked, they quietly turn into pressure machines, tools for personal gain disguised as civic responsibility. And that isn't just an HOA problem. That's a human one. What saved me wasn't cleverness or technology or even the cabin itself. It was patience. I didn't react when I wanted to. I didn't argue when arguing would have changed nothing. I gathered information. I talked to people. I listened, and I let patterns reveal themselves. That kind of advice is uncomfortable. I know patience feels passive, but it isn't. Patience is active restraint. It's choosing not to strike until the other person has already stepped into their own mess. After Eleanor was removed, the HOA was restructured. New leadership was elected. Rules were rewritten with transparency instead of intimidation. Neighbors replanted gardens they'd been forced to tear out. Docks were repaired instead of condemned. And for the first time in years, people stopped whispering at meetings. As for the cabin, I kept it almost exactly as my grandfather left it. I updated the plumbing, fixed the wiring, made everything safe and functional, but I didn't erase its character. The creaks are still there, the quirks, the soul of the place, because the cabin was never the problem. It was a reminder that not everything needs to be modernized, optimized, or monetized. Some things are valuable precisely because they resist that mindset. Sometimes I sit on the dock in the evenings watching the water calm as the sun sets, and I think about how close I came to selling the place just to make the stress go away. I'm glad I didn't, because the real victory wasn't watching someone lose power. It was watching a community realize it never needed to give that power away in the first place. So if you're dealing with an HOA, a boss, or a local authority that feels more like a bully than a steward, remember this. You don't have to outshout them. You don't have to outmuscle them. You just have to outlast them. Document everything. Learn the rules better than they do, and don't interrupt people while they're busy showing you who they really are. That's the real trap, and it works every time.